Welcome back to another episode of the Rational Football League Show. My name is Emmett. I'm here with my co-host Brendan Ford.
Yo, what's up, y'all?
We are on episode 27, guys. Thank you for those that have been listening with us so far, and hopefully you keep enjoying what we do. You guys can find us on YouTube, Instagram, Spotify, TikTok, and Twitter. We got some fun segments. We're going to be looking at the college football playoff and seeing which teams we think have the best chance to make it, what the strengths and weaknesses. And we're going to be discussing the Giants' future at quarterback a little later on. So stick with us throughout that. But first things first, for this week, like we kind of mentioned in the opening, we're going to look at the top 5 college teams this season. The ones that have the best chance to make the playoffs right now because they're all undefeated. We're going to start breaking down their strengths, their weaknesses, what we see going for them. So let's get right into it, B. So before we get right into it, why don't you guys hop down in the comment section and let us know what you think. Who do you think of the top 5? Who do you think is going to win it all this year? Does Georgia have a three-peat? Do we have a surprise contender? Can Michigan, shut out the outside noise and take the title? Let us know what you think in the comment section. Again, hit the like button. Give us a subscribe if you aren't subscribed to us. We do this every week. We love talking with you guys, and we usually respond pretty quick when you get into the comments. But let's go through their weaknesses first, B. For those that don't know, we have 5 teams in the top 10 in no particular order. We have Georgia, Michigan, Ohio State, Florida State, and Washington. B, I'll let you go first with Georgia. What is the weakness of Georgia?
Yeah, Georgia. I mean, what are they not good at? Like we were thinking about, we were talking in our pre-show prepping for this segment, and I was looking over the numbers. I was like, what even is there to even nitpick about this team? I mean, at this point in time, I'm surprised if they don't have to repeat this season. I mean, they are just so damn good. And last night, beat the brakes off Ole Miss, and that was a top 10 team. Like, damn, dude. I mean, this is kind of a lane point. This is kind of a duck, but I'm just put it out there. I mean, maybe the biggest weakness right now is Carson Beck being a first-year starter. He is a junior, but he is inexperienced. Again, sorry, Georgia fans or college football fans, whatever. I have not watched every single snap of Georgia to watch Carson Beck in action. I didn't dive deep into his film, so I, for one, think he's super, super good. But just looking at his numbers, he has thrown 5 picks this year. I don't know how those picks happened. Where was he just inaccurate with the football? Did he make a bad decision? The ball get tipped up and this got picked up. I don't know how that happens. But he did throw 5 picks so far this season, so maybe you can say his inexperience with being out there and playing and reading the field or whatnot caused him to turn over the ball and not being safe with it. And again, that's a lane point because I'm looking at the rest of their numbers and they look strong across the board on all units.
I will say that's fair. I don't think it's a lane point. I think it's a fair point because, there's a human side to this. These aren't people. They're not machines. It's not, Madden. He is a first-year starter, which, you can get through a regular season. But now you start playing only the big boys. You want to start playing Ohio States and Michigans and Florida States and those kind of teams. The margin for error is much smaller. The game moves a little bit quicker, like we saw with Ohio State, Georgia last year, where no one had picked Ohio State to win that game, but it came down to the wire. I'm not saying I don't think Georgia can win it all. I'm just saying I think that's a fair point because there is a human element to this game. For me, the weakness I have for Georgia is their strength of schedule. I mean, they don't have many holes in the roster. That's just the fact of life. They are by far the best team in college football. And it's just weird because I haven't had a chance to watch a whole lot of their tape, but they are just dominating teams week in, week out. Like I said, just beat the brakes off of a top 10 Ole Miss team, who I have watched a couple of games, and I thought they were a pretty solid team. But here's my concern with them, right? They maybe don't have a top 10 quarterback in college football. I did include that in my points. But you can ask Stetson Bennett how much that really played a role in preventing them from winning 2 national titles. But they still have to play Tennessee next. They play Tennessee this week. Who did just get their brakes beat off by Mizzou, but still Tennessee. It's still a rivalry game. It's still big game. Those two don't like each other at all. Then you have You got to finish the season playing number 8 Alabama, who probably is going to be moving up a little bit more. They just had a dominating win as well. And it kind of takes me back to a little bit we talked about earlier in the season when Alabama was playing Texas. And I said, if Texas was playing Alabama late in the year, I would take Alabama 10 times out of 10. Because, like we've seen now, they've turned it around. They've figured it out. Jalen Milrose, again, compared to Lamar Jackson, Michael Vick, and Percy Harvin, and all these other guys, Reggie Bush, and all these other guys. He seems to have finally figured it out. That young, inexperienced roster has now got the experience they need. So I don't think they're any slouch. I think, after this week, they'll probably move to about 6, probably, maybe 7, depending on how teams felt about Oregon's beating of USC. So you have still got to play your 2 biggest rivals here in Tennessee and Alabama, and then sandwiched in between those two, you have Georgia Tech. In-state rivalry game, but a potential trap game there. While you just got done beating the crap out of Tennessee, and now you have to look forward to Alabama. It could be a potential possibility, maybe, that they overlook Georgia Tech a little bit here. And I don't want to get into scenarios and how this all shake out if they do lose to Alabama. But for me, that's what I think the biggest weakness is for them. And it's not much of a weakness, but it's still technically something that needs to be considered. You still have to play Alabama, who has clearly flipped the switch. You have a potential trap game in Georgia Tech, and you have a huge rivalry game this week against Tennessee. So,
yeah, and the +1 that too. They might have to play Bama twice, right? We were talking about the pre-show. They might have to play him again in the at the conference title game. So it's gonna be tough. It's gonna be a gauntlet.
That will be interesting how that plays out. Because even if they beat Alabama, you got to play them again the next week after that. So, moving on. Michigan. What do you think is the weakness for Michigan?
Yeah, this is another good team. I watched a few of their games this season. I was looking over the numbers too. They don't have many gaps either. Again, this might be a duck of a point, but it's just more posed as a question for their weakness. Is are they able to play from behind? Being as a run first team, I haven't seen them tested a whole lot this season, right? And as we get in the later stages of this season, you will have to play OSU. And then assuming they win the Big Ten, you will have to play a really good team in the playoff. Are you going to be able just to dominate, that team in the run game? Again, I'm kind of getting ahead of myself here, right? But let's say they play a Georgia. The Georgia has a top 10 defense in the entire country. Are you going to be able to impose your will on them to run the ball and rely on your tough defense and running the ball to win that game? What if there's a scenario where they're down 14-0 in the first quarter, just somehow, right? Do they have enough weapons and the passing game to kind of make up that gap? So that's my first point. And then my second point, we kind of alluded to it early on in the podcast here, is they're off the field distractions throughout the entire season with Jim Harbaugh. I mean, we talked about his suspension. Doesn't seem much of a conflict. I mean, he's still being with the team for the rest of the season here. During the week, he won't be there on the sidelines, but it kind of makes you wonder that they are humans and they're dealing with all this off the field stuff to just catch up with them over the last few weeks of this season. So those are my 2 points here.
Yeah, and
what are your thoughts on them?
I think those are fair points. I definitely put the same thing as for their weakness. That's the outside noise. It has to be. You compare that with, again, they've played a weaker schedule. That's been the criticism of Michigan all year. They have played probably the weakest schedule of all the remaining top 5 teams. The only reason I didn't include it as an official weakness was because they did just beat Penn State. So it's hard to sit here and go, well, it just beat Penn State, but they have a weak schedule. So, but they have. Every other game outside of Penn State has pretty much been a cupcake game. But the outside noise. And again, these guys are people. That not being around to have your head coach on Saturdays does play a role. If it didn't, these guys would be wearing free Harbaugh shirts. The offensive coordinator would be getting emotional after a big win over Penn State at a whiteout game. That guy obviously means something to that team. When you're struggling, your all line's not getting it going, you're not having a good run game, you can look to that guy and go, yeah, all right, we're going to figure this out. So I do think it plays a significant role in that. So we'll see how that's going to be a huge emotional game going against Ohio State and Ryan Day, who allegedly was the one that kind of started this whole investigation into the spy scandal, the sign stealing scandal. So that's going to be a huge emotional game that Harbaugh's not going to be able to be on the sideline for. How do they overcome that? Do they, let that play roll into their play? Do we see a high penalty game in that game? I think it's just a fair thing to bring up is how do you handle the outside noise? Can you keep playing with this emotional high the whole time to finish out the season? Moving on, we have Ohio State. I'm curious to get your take on this one. What is the weakness for Ohio State?
Yeah, when I watched this OSU team, their defense overall is the strength of their team, but within that defense though, one thing that strikes me as a negative is the defense's lack of sacks and turnovers they have garnered throughout the season so far. So they only have 19 sacks so far this season, and that's about 2 per game. And seeing as though they have highly recruited and ranked players on that D line, you would think that number would be a lot higher, right? So they're not getting a lot of production out of their edge rushers and in that interior D line. Also, they have 6 picks this season. So, I think, the sacks with the turnovers kind of go hand in hand. We get more and more pressure. You should be able to get more turnovers. They're not turning over, or they're not getting a lot of turnovers for that turnover margin. And in comparison or in scope for the rest of the season, when you come up with these big games, sometimes that one turnover can determine that entire game. That one play, right? Get a turnover and that plus side of that field to go get points. So I think that is a weakness for that defense right now. Is they have to get the sacks up and get more picks. Also, watching their offense, I think it's clear that Kyle McCord is the weakness of that offense right now. I mean, given they have a bunch of talent, right? They have a bunch of first-round talent around him, right? But Kyle McCord right now, to me, is not a multiplier of his talent. Marvin Harrison Jr. is going to be top 3 pick regardless, right? But you see some games with Kyle McCord, and I kind of gave him a pass against, Notre Dame. I think they played him the 3rd week. And again, this is his first year starting, so I kind of didn't think anything of it. He did miss a couple of throws, and he looked rattled. I'm like, okay, it's his 3rd game, primetime games, whatever. But then, we watched him play against Penn State, which Penn State is a really good defense. I don't want to knock, him, McCord, against that Penn State offense, or I'm sorry, that Penn State defense. But the offense was sputtering, and most of it was because he just was missing throws. He was not, accurate. He had happy feet. He seemed as though he was just lost out there. And if you, don't watch a whole lot of OSU, you might think I'm crazy. You look at his, box score, and his stats are great. He has 2,700 yards passing, 20 touchdowns, and 4 picks. But in those prime time games here, he is struggling at times. Even against, Wisconsin, 2 picks for crazy throws. What are you doing, dude? So that for me, I guess with OSU's offense, Kyle McCord is definitely the weakness. And if they lose a game here towards the end of the season, or if they come out somehow sneak through and win the Big Ten and go in the playoff, I can foresee him being the reason why they end up losing. It's because you have a Ferrari outside of that quarterback position with Marvin Harrison Jr. Ibuka is a great talent. Henderson at running back is a great talent. Then you have McCord, who's just not experienced right now, and he could kind of hinder that offense.
Yeah, I mean, I really harped on that too. I know we've talked about throughout the season. I think Ohio State's got top 3 defense in the country. I know the sack production isn't where you'd like, and the interception production isn't where you'd like. But they are, in the same way Michigan's like a suffocating offense, Ohio State's like a suffocating defense. I would be really, really curious to see what their percentage is on 3rd and 4th down where they get off the field. It has to be among the top in all the country. They don't miss tackles. They're right assignment. They execute perfectly every time. It's not flashy defense. It's fundamental defense they play, which is kind of funny, and I don't want to jump too far ahead here, but it's almost like the exact opposite of Washington, where Washington has terrible fundamentals, but they make so many opportunistic plays, it keeps them in the game. The right time pick, a right time sack keeps them in. Versus Ohio State, from play 1 to play 70, I get efficiency. They are chasing dudes down. They're suffocating. They're not giving up yak. They're not missing tackles. Like, running backs aren't getting the second and third level. They usually are met at the line or slightly past the line. So I love their defense. But the weakness for me is definitely McCord. He has too many stretches where he just looks like an average quarterback, and that's kind of being generous there. Um, he's young. He can still get better week by week, and I think that Notre Dame game definitely gave him some confidence because before that he looked lost out there. But he definitely has looked much better now. But I do want to go back to that Notre Dame game where that's exactly what we're talking about in the weakness. There was like 3 opportunities in that game where Notre Dame defenders had their ball right on the hand in that final drive that could have just sealed the end of that game. Sometimes it's better lucky than good. They did drop them. They did go down. They did win that game. Absolutely. But again, if you're playing Georgia, they're not dropping those balls. If you're playing Michigan, they're not dropping those balls. You can't have those stretches, especially not on a game-winning drive. When your defense has pitched you a perfect game and kept it at 17, and you just need to go down and score, you can't hand the ball to the defense 3 times and just hope them to drop it. Because that won't happen when you're playing in Georgia. That won't happen when you're playing in Michigan. And I'd venture to guess that wouldn't happen when you're playing in FSU either. They're too good at what they do. So for me, that's the biggest thing. And I think, again, like you said, the numbers. When you're throwing to a receiver who could be a Heisman candidate, I mean, it's going to make it look better. Remember how Mac Jones looked at Alabama throwing to Devontae Smith? It's just you're going to look better. He had 3 touchdowns. What was it yesterday? Throwing to Marvin Harrison. On shit, Marvin Harrison did that. I could have made that throw. You could have made that throw. My sister could make that throw. That dude is just so good. He gets the quarterback right even when he's wrong. So that's the biggest thing for me. It's an inexperienced thing. It's a young thing. He's still going to improve. I expect him to still improve. I think next year he's going to be even better. But we're not looking at next year. We're looking at the rest of this season and the playoffs. Moving on, I think we got 2 teams left. Florida State. What's their weakness?
So Florida State, they have talent, but I have on here, do they have as much talent as the other top 5 teams? And I say that because they had a few scares, especially a few weeks ago against Boston College. Or I don't know if it's a few weeks ago, but they almost lost the game to Boston College. And I watched a few of their games, and again, like, I don't have. This is more like just one-off notes. But when I watch the game with the eye test buzzword, they just don't seem as though they have much talent as a Georgia or a Michigan. You know what I mean? Like, I try to envision, like, how would this Florida State team pair up with a Georgia? And I think that Georgia would win by like 30. This is going off the eye test. I did dig deeper into their numbers, and I think that their defensive unit is probably their weakest unit. Even though, like, their points per game allowed is great. They only give up 17 points. And then you kind of ask yourself, well, who have they played, though? They beat LSU at the beginning of the season, which was a great win. But who else have they played? And then you look at their yards allowed per game. They're giving up 333 yards a game, which is a good amount of yards. And once we talk about the strengths of the top 5 teams, you will get a better scope or, context of how many yards or how bad their defense can be at times. But to me, it comes down to, do they have enough of the blue chip talent to go against a Georgia or a Michigan? And even though the points allowed per game is good, 17 points, they're giving up a lot of yards, which could come back and haunt them in a top 5 matchup.
Yeah. And for those wondering, well, you guys said, hey, you said talk about their strengths. Don't worry. If you're watching the podcast episode, we'll begin to that. If you're watching this as a segment, you're going to have to wait till it comes out. But for me, the weakness for them is, I think you touched on it perfectly. It's the strength of schedule. I do think they have stellar blue chip players. I like Travis. I like Johnny. I like Keon Coleman has blown me away this season. Frank Verse on the defensive line's been stellar. I think they're almost a little top heavy. But again, the problem is who have they played? Like you mentioned, they beat LSU, number 6 LSU, or no, I'm sorry, number 5 LSU to start the year, and then they beat Clemson, who was unranked when they played. That's it. Those are their biggest wins. They're eking out wins against the U. They're eking out wins against Boston College, and Wake Forest wasn't much. So as good as they may be, it's hard. Like you said, you got to do an eye test. I can't pin them up against a Florida or another good team they played. I'm sorry, I think they did before, but I can't pin them up against another great team they played and be like, oh, well, see, here's how they face against this top 10 team later in the season, and they look fantastic. They seem, again, I mentioned they seem very top heavy to me, but also I really love their head coach, Mike Norvell. I think he should be in consideration for coach of the year. He's coached his ass off with that team. But yeah, again, I'm curious to see how they fare in the playoffs. They're either going to do well and rise to the moment, or they're going to get embarrassed as a team that hasn't played anyone all year and get blown out by Georgia by 30. So yeah. I don't think there's an in between with this team. It's such a boom or bust team.
Yep, agreed.
Moving on to our last one here, Washington Huskies, a team we picked in the preseason. We did a whole video on. We love them coming into the year. What's the weakness of the Huskies?
Yeah, this one's a little bit easier. I think it's clear cut. It's their defense, man. Defense does not exist in the Pac-12. They just don't play defense there. They're giving up 410 yards a game. And 24 points a game, dude. They're lucky they have one of, if not the best overall offense in the country, because they are just letting anyone score at will. So yeah, this was an easier answer. It's clearly their defense is their biggest weakness.
Yeah, I agree. I was watching the game yesterday, and again, every Washington game has felt like a must see this year just because of how exciting that offense is. But it's hard not to notice. They're having to fight now every game to win. They have been fortunate to make opportunistic plays at the right moment. A key pick, there's a moment yesterday where they had an interception, almost returned for a touchdown, would have sealed the game for them, and the dude just dropped it on the 1 yard line. Not even fucking close to scoring. And thankfully, they did get a safety on the next play. But yeah, if they get to the playoffs and they're not as opportunistic as they have been, it could get ugly. Again, I don't think they'll get blown out because their offense is too good. Their offense is too good to get blown out. But I see it very hard for them to win a playoff game with the way their defense is currently. All right, bands, let's flip it. We'll do a reverse order since we're on Washington. For those that have just watched this segment, if it does a segment for you, thanks for tuning in to tell us what you think. What do you agree with us? What do you disagree? Who has a chance to win this whole thing?